Good afternoon, although it depends what time you're watching this video, so it might be a good morning or good evening even, but there you go. Good day and welcome to the second of one of my big chats. Not quite sure how long these will be going for. They will certainly happen while I feel I've got a couple of things to say. But over the last couple of weeks I've been really doing some thinking about what's called local theology, and a lot of this ties in with Laurie Green's pastoral cycle, which I believe that Greenmount and Dundee are going to be exploring very well soon with Kate down during the summer months, which I'm really excited about. I'm sorry I can't go to most of those because I'm off on holiday, but I wish Kate all the best, and she's certainly top of the prayer list. Sorry, Richard, you have to be second for the moment. Anyway, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, basically, I want to explore the question in ministry: does one size fit all? Does one size indeed fit all? For example, what happens down in the church in London, would it work well up here, maybe in the north of Manchester, or would it need some tweaking or something, or would it just totally flop and fail altogether and something unique up here needs to happen? Does one size fit all? That is a good question. I think there's a mixed answer to that. It's very easy to say just yes or no. We know that Holy Trinity Brompton, that model of church, does actually get exported all around the country. So that is a sort of one size model. And obviously we know that from when we go shopping, or especially when we go buying our hamburgers, one McDonald's in the north of Britain looks very similar to the one down in London. So if we take that question, does one size fit all, and apply it to churches, where do we stand? I would be tempted on the whole to say the answer is no, it doesn't work very well. Each church and each community are so different, and what works in one place might not work in another. So I want to explore the idea that a church needs to find its own unique voice that's bespoke and really rooted in its community. Now, how does it find that voice? I want to suggest that for this reason, for us to find our voice as a church, as an individual bespoke church with its own unique calling and ministry, we need to listen to two other voices. Let's find out a bit more. So if the one size fit all model is like a thing being imposed upon you from above, what's the alternative? Obviously it's coming up from below, so it's a grassroots movement coming up, and so that gives us an indication of the first voice we should listen to, and I'm sure we're quite familiar with those voices that we know in our communities. And each church must be familiar with those voices, or the voice that comes from its community. All communities reside in a specific landscape, and that's formed by the culture, the intellectual feel, the emotional feel as well, and all of these come together to create the circumstances and the voice that arises from that local culture. So let's start by using a computer analogy, and now I've got to refer to my notes because it gets complicated, so rather than facing the computer all the time. Now, I'm not an expert, but what I'm told is that for computers have actually three elements. We have on one side the software, so we all know that might be Windows, it might be Google, it might be Zoom, that sort of thing, or some apps. On the other side is the hardware, and that's the computer itself, or some others. The printer, stuff like that. But those by itself are not enough. You need something in the middle to make the two work. And so between those, you have what's called middleware. And the middleware brings the two together and makes the whole thing work effectively. So if we take that idea and expand it into our church life situation, on one side you've got the software. So that could be our soft practices. That could be our pastoral care. That could be doing funerals. It could be how we visit people who are in hospital. It could be weddings. It could be baptisms. All sorts of things that actually are the practical outlay of church life. And on the other, that's the hardware. So that could be our church doctrines. If you know your church history, there's various confessions, and like we have the Westminster Confession, for example. You could have various theological doctrines that have come over the years down from church history. It could be pronouncements from synod. It could be legal stuff imposed upon us from government as well. So you could say that's the hardware. But to bring these together in a local situation, they don't work, and you need what's called like a theological middleware or a local theology to help bring the two together. And middleware in computer language is often referred to as like a glue that can combine software and hardware together. So like a local theology in the church situation is the glue that brings our hard practices and our soft practices together and makes sense. But also what it does, it brings in the local voice too, so all three come together. So we always get to the number three, which is quite interesting, but it brings all three together to make them mesh together, so it produces something unique. And that local theology, responding to our practices, responding to where we come from, all the hard stuff, and responding to the local story, that starts to become the second voice, which is our voice, which is all very exciting. However, that voice is not yet fully formed. So, with all of this, a church's voice is starting to take shape. The first voice is the local voice of the community itself. That reflects the intellectual, the emotional, and the cultural aspects of that community and various other things beside. And that slowly informs our voice, which is starting to take shape. However, our voice is not yet fully formed, which brings us to our third voice. Now, there's an American pastor called Tim Keller, who's a really interesting guy because he went to work in one of the urban situations in New York where local churches have been running from. You know, a lot of churches in the States, they prefer to be in the conservative areas, in the Bible Belt, in rural places where there's still a bit of a hangover of church culture left over. Where it's kind of a bit more urban, where people aren't interested in church, they've been putting out. But Tim has gone and started a church, and he's seeing massive growth. So it does work. But he says this: a church needs to deeply ponder and consider the landscape of the culture where it lives. So that, again, that's the intellectual, the emotional, and the cultural part of that landscape. And this consideration, this deep brooding that he says the church needs to do, it's more than just analytical. It's not data. It's not analysing data or science. It's actually prayerful. Prayerfully considering the culture where it resides. And likewise, there was a Trappist monk, quite a well-known one, I'm sure you've heard of his name. He is called Thomas Merton. And he says, which echoes Keller's point, is that prayer should be meditative and contemplative. And what it does is the true person of prayer, I've got to read this from the sheet here to get this right, listens to his culture or her culture and questions that culture humbly and courageously, exposing to the culture what it wishes to ignore about itself, both good and bad. And this consideration from both Keller and both Merton says that we don't use our church buildings to run away from the culture. Even a monk who you might think they're withdrawing from a culture and going to live a life of solitude in some ivory tower. But what they're doing is actually, through prayer, they're actually analysing. They're considering and contemplating the nature and state of the soul of the culture that they reside in, where they reside in, and bringing it to God in prayer, and they're able to sort of start to see this culture almost literally through the eyes of God. And that's what this third voice, this voice of God, is trying to get us to do, is to hear what God is saying about that culture, and we have to try and discern that. Now, I come from an evangelical background, and I've certainly been at the receiving end of some dubious words of knowledge, and we need to be careful with all this, because we're not pronouncing judgment or brimstone and fire. It's far from that. It's the other end of the spectrum. This is God showing his love to the community. So it's a really good question to ask. Does God speak to local communities? Or does God have a one-size-fits-all voice that he just drops on everyone and we all have to listen? Or is it more nuanced? Now, there's an answer to that which is quite easy. Firstly, I believe that in the physical world, there's always a spiritual mirror. So if we're hearing in the physical world that each communities have bespoke voices to hear, I think we can see that from the mirror perspective, that God will be responding to each culture or each community separately too. So, do we have actually some theological consideration to help us in asking if God has a local voice of his own for local communities? Now, there is a really good one which I'd like to draw upon, and that is from the book of Revelations, because we know that God speaks very clearly with different things to say to 7 different communities, things that are both positive and also words of caution. For example, he says to the church of Ephesus, "I know your deeds, your hard work and your perseverance. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the first love. Now, you have forsaken the love that you had at first." Which is obviously talking about a love of God rather than a love of a partner or something like that. And also elsewhere, the prophet Elijah talks about hearing the voice of God in stillness. And again, this picks up on the theme of Thomas Merton and Tim Keller of considering through prayer our communities. And in 1 Kings we find this: "After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard this whisper, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave." Now, in that situation, he'd gone up to a mountain, and there'd been an earthquake, there'd been a fire, there'd been strong wind, and the thought was God would speak through one of these 3 loud bits of noise. But it's in the stillness and in the quiet where God's voice is heard. And this further reminds us of the nature of contemplative or silent prayer, and the need to discern God's voice from the background noise of our local communities. Because I believe very clearly that the voice of God is not necessarily the voice of the community, although God can obviously speak through the community. We need to recognise that these 2 voices, the community and God's voice, are distinctly different from each other and may have different things to say. And our prayer for consideration is bringing these 2 voices together to find how these inform our local theology. So, in conclusion, developing a local theology, I believe, is essential for our churches. And for many of us, we live in our communities and we know those voices and we think we know our communities. I would say, however, if you feel that you've been changed by the pandemic over the last 18 months, welcome to the club. So have I, and so has everybody else. So that means our communities that we thought we knew before the lockdown started, they're different now. And I think a lot of us are feeling a bit dazed and confused, wondering what our new communities are going to look like. And that's exciting and scary at the same time. So again, it was a reminder afresh to humbly listen to our communities and see what's arising afresh from them. Because what we thought we knew 2 years ago, I'm pretty sure will have changed in some way, shape or form because of people's experiences of the pandemic. And also we need to listen to the voice of God. And through bringing these together, these two voices brought together through prayer, in doing so we find our own voice, our own local theology, which I'd like to say is actually, if this is done properly, is prophetic. This voice of God we can then speak into the community and speak with theological thoroughness, with sensitivity, with compassion, and also recognising that communities are not fully formed. We're all on a journey, and there might be something that our church might say to a community to help it on its way to get to a better place. So this is the second chat, exploring local theology, hearing the voice of God, the voice of the community, bringing those together, and from that emerges a voice of our own, which will be the voice of local theology. I hope you've enjoyed this. I think there's going to be a third big chat coming very soon. I've got one brewing in the back of my mind already, inspired by a couple of local news headlines. I'm Dan Harris, if those of you who don't know me. I'm a minister with the United Reformed Church, and God bless you and have a safe week.